This terrifying story is about a young man named Justin Bieber who went to the capital city to participate in a talent contest and was relying on a broker to help him find accommodation. When the broker took him to view a relatively cheap house, they happened to encounter a man from the neighboring house going insane. The broker casually mentioned that the man was mad, claiming that a female ghost was haunting him, constantly screaming and causing trouble like that. The broker then led Justin Bieber to the house next door, which was quite old and somewhat scary, but the rent was cheap. The broker gave him a tour of the house. Apart from one locked room, the other rooms were free for him to use. He warned Justin not to open the locked room, as it contained many of the owner's old belongings. He chose a relatively cleaner room, and after tidying it up, it was already well into the night. As he was about to lay down on the bed to sleep, he suddenly heard the sound of a door opening outside. The noise caught his attention. Then he thought to himself, wasn't he the only one renting this large house? Could it be a thief? So he quietly opened a window to look outside. To his surprise, the locked room's window suddenly opened, and strangely, he saw a faint white figure inside, as if someone was there. Suddenly, a woman dressed in white flew out of the window. It was terrifying, a female ghost with a demonic face. Justin, curious, mustered the courage to follow the ghost's movements. He saw it fly past the wall into the house next door. Perhaps the man who went mad earlier had been haunted by this female ghost. To make sure he wasn't seeing things, he cautiously went outside and approached the locked room. He peered inside and thought that if he told this ghost story on stage, it would definitely cause a sensation, and people would pay attention to him. So he suppressed his fear and decided to uncover this secret. Inside the room, he saw a coffin. The terrifying part was that the coffin lid was open. Justin, being quite brave, jumped into the room and slowly and nervously approached the coffin. As Justin had guessed, the coffin was completely empty. Perhaps the female ghost had flown out of here. Suddenly, Justin remembered that the I Ching could repel evil spirits and avoid misfortune. So he returned to his room to find the I Ching scrolls and placed them around the coffin. After that, he went back to his room to observe. As dawn approached, the female ghost flew back from the neighboring yard, intending to enter the room. However, she was struck by a beam of golden light that prevented her from entering. The female ghost tried several times to enter, but each time she was repelled by the light. At that moment, it seemed like she had noticed Justin secretly watching her from the darkness of the room opposite. Suddenly, she broke open Justin's window to his surprise. She rushed toward him, gripping his neck tightly, her anger evident. Justin could clearly see the horrifying appearance of the female ghost, leaving him speechless in fear. In his delirium, Justin heard the crow of a rooster and then lost consciousness. When he woke up, it was already bright outside. Justin could still feel the pain from the ghost squeezing his neck, his whole body drenched in sweat, gasping for breath. But what was even more terrifying was that Justin was horrified to find the corpse of the female ghost lying next to him. His body stiffened, and he felt his life force draining away. He sensed that death was near. A week later, the stench of decay emanated from the house. Villagers discovered the young man's body in the room, covered in blisters, and beside him was the dried-up corpse of the woman. They took both of them and disposed of them. From that time on, the villagers whispered to each other about the men who suddenly went mad after being haunted by the female ghost, or about the mysterious death of the young man Justin after encountering the ghost. This chilling tale tells of a man named Peter Parker, an accountant by profession, who specialized in balancing books and helping others with their finances. One day, he had to travel to a nearby town to settle the accounts of a client. He bade his wife and children farewell, promising to return home soon. The town buzzed with activity, bustling with the hurried energy of end-of-year trade and commerce. Once Peter finished with his last client's accounts, he quickly said his goodbyes and began his journey home. The shortcut from the town to the harbor was dark and foreboding. He carried a lantern and hurried, deciding to walk to save money by refusing the offer of a horse-drawn carriage. After walking for miles, a strange weariness began to grip him. Everything felt off. The farther he walked, the more exhausted his legs became, yet his destination remained elusive. Just then, through the trees, he spotted a grand mansion. Thinking it might be a place to ask for a drink of water and directions, Peter approached and knocked on the door. A servant appeared, and Peter explained his need. However, the servant seemed reluctant to let him in. At that moment, an elderly man appeared and instructed the servant to invite Peter inside. He seemed unbothered by the unexpected guest. The old man, with a kind and welcoming air, invited Peter to join him for dinner. He also warned that the woods were treacherous at night and suggested Peter stay the night, leaving in the morning for his own safety. Peter, not wanting to seem impolite, accepted the invitation. Having heard of robbers in the woods, he thought it wise to stay the night rather than risk traveling further. After some conversation, Peter learned that the old man had several daughters. He then suggested the old man invite his daughters to join them for dinner. The old man took a sip of his tea, cleared his throat, and called his daughters. Peter glanced up, and his eyes immediately widened in shock. Out of the room came 5 young women, each in her 20s, with ethereal beauty, gentle and demure, radiating an almost otherworldly grace. As the dinner continued, Peter no longer had any appetite. He hadn't expected this mansion to be home to such mesmerizing women. Eating became secondary, and even the weariness in his body faded. Peter felt a strange exhilaration, caught in a web of enchantment. Every woman he laid eyes on was more stunning than the last. He was astonished that such beauty could exist in this remote mansion, a secret no one had ever spoken of. To his further surprise, as the dinner progressed, the old man noticed Peter's distracted gaze and nodded, subtly hinting that he was considering marrying one of his daughters to Peter and inviting him to stay. Peter, initially ready to agree, hesitated when he thought of his wife and children. His conscience pricked at him, and he confessed the truth. The old man, unfazed, replied that in these modern times it was normal for men to have multiple wives. He casually suggested Peter choose one of his daughters as a second wife. Peter found himself in a dilemma, as all 5 daughters were stunning, and the idea of choosing one was unbearable. Seeing Peter's discomfort, the old man offered an intriguing solution. He could live with all 5 daughters according to their family tradition, and after a time, choose the one he desired most. Hearing this, Peter felt as though he had fallen into a vivid, fantastical dream. He could no longer refuse the temptation. Over the following days, Peter spent time with each of the 5 daughters in turn. The more he spent time with them, the more confused he became. Each night he lay with a different woman, each one leaving him stirred and yearning, but this indulgence began to drain his energy. One night, after a passionate encounter with the youngest, Peter collapsed in exhaustion and quickly fell into a deep troubled sleep. Suddenly, a loud noise erupted outside, accompanied by flashing lights. Peter thought thieves had arrived and scrambled to his feet, alarmed. He instinctively reached to protect the woman beside him, but when he turned, she had vanished. The door was suddenly flung open and armed figures stormed into the room. They demanded confirmation of Peter's identity. Gesturing for him to follow, they ushered him out of the room. Peter believed they were thieves who intended to kill him. He panicked, looking back to see smoke rising from the mansion. He muttered prayers, begging for his life. Once outside, Peter turned around to look back, and the smoke cleared. There was no mansion, no family, only a desolate grave, smoke billowing from its open mouth. As Peter stood there, still in disbelief, a few people approached. They murmured to each other, confirming that they had found everything. Peter was bewildered and had no idea what was happening. Then, his gaze fell to the ground, and what he saw made his blood run cold. Scattered on the ground were the bodies of a large fox and 5 smaller ones. He learned from the group that they were hunters hired by his wife to track him down. Peter thought he had spent a month at the mansion, but in reality, only 3 nights had passed. His wife, concerned when he hadn't returned, sent people to search for him. He was shocked by how quickly he had been drained of energy. Thankfully, his kind-hearted wife had forgiven him and cared for him when he returned. After recovering, Peter found that he could no longer engage in marital relations. However, the ordeal had taught him a lesson. He no longer indulged in the pursuit of fleeting beauty, and instead returned to his loving wife, cherishing her and their children more than ever. It is said that 2 scholars were traveling to the capital to take part in an exam. The one in purple robes was named Tony, and the one in blue robes was named Thor. As night fell, they began looking for a place to rest. Arriving in the town late at night, all the inns were already full. During the exam season, most scholars had reserved rooms in advance, leaving nearly no vacancies. The 2 men asked from one inn to the next, but every place was fully booked. Just as they were about to give up, Tony noticed a light glowing in the distance from an inn. He quickly told Thor to hurry over and check if they could find a room there. They approached and asked, and to their luck, there was still a room available. They decided to stay. However, it seemed the innkeeper had tripled the price, but Tony was willing to pay that extra cost. To maintain peace and quiet, the 2 decided to sleep in separate rooms, with a wall between them. Just as Tony was about to fall asleep, the door to his room suddenly flew open. At first, he thought perhaps the innkeeper had arranged for them to share a room with other guests, thinking the man was just being cheeky. But when he looked closely, 2 figures stood before him, both strange and unsettling. One of them was a towering figure, so tall that his head nearly touched the ceiling. He wore a blue hat and blue robes, with a thick, eerie blue beard. The other figure was short and plump, also dressed entirely in blue. As these strange individuals entered the room, a chill ran through the air, causing Tony's body to stiffen in fear. What happened next shocked him even more. The 2 figures began dancing in a bizarre manner, accompanied by strange drumming. Tony broke into a cold sweat, his body paralyzed. He tried to cry out to Thor for help, but no sound came from his throat. However, he could clearly hear Thor's voice coming from the room next door, pleading for help. Just as Tony's heartbeat grew frantic and he felt himself slipping into unconsciousness, a third figure appeared, a man wearing a headscarf and a scruffy beard. This man seemed to be the leader of the two odd figures. He growled at the two blue-clad individuals, warning them not to touch the person before them. With the leader's arrival, Tony was able to sit up and hear Thor's voice from next door, still calling for help. Thor appeared, stumbling towards Tony's room. His legs were weak, his gait unsteady, and his pants hung loosely as if he had just endured something horrendous. Thor was visibly terrified, his eyes swollen with tears, and his face smeared with snot. He muttered that he had just seen ghosts, his account of the event shockingly clear. Thor explained that, as he was about to sleep, the door had blown open unexpectedly. Suddenly, terrifying faces with glowing green eyes appeared in the dark, slithering and growling as they crawled under his bed and hovered over him. The monstrous faces loomed closer, suffocating him as he gasped for air. At that moment, Thor could only freeze in fear, unable to speak, as the grotesque heads swirled around his bed. Just as he thought he was going to die, the terrifying faces recoiled and disappeared. It seemed they had seen something beneath his pants that frightened them, and they vanished. Both men were convinced that something was deeply wrong with the inn. They quickly changed clothes and decided to stay awake together until morning. As the rooster crowed at dawn, they immediately saddled their horses and fled the inn, not daring to look back as they made their way to the capital. During that year's exams, Tony passed with the highest honors. There were rumors that Tony was destined for greatness, and some believed that his survival was due to divine protection. After the ordeal, Tony learned that the inn where he and Thor had stayed was the site of a horrifying event. All 28 scholars who had stayed there during the exam season had mysteriously died under unknown circumstances. This terrifying story is about a wealthy man named Ronald Tramp, who was famously stingy in the area. He didn't need to do anything as he inherited a vast fortune from his father's investments. One day, he took his dog named Lele to a tavern for a meal. He ordered some delicious dishes and enjoyed the meal to his heart's content. He had always lived this way, carefree, without a wife or children. While eating, a beggar outside the door called out asking for food. Mr. Tramp was used to this scene. The beggar, so hungry that he staggered while walking, weakly begged Mr. Tramp for some leftover food to fill his stomach. At that moment, Mr. Tramp raised a chicken leg in front of him. The beggar knelt down, holding out a bowl as if expecting to receive the chicken leg. Everyone in the tavern was surprised by Mr. Tramp's generosity. "Lele, this is for you. After eating, you have to guard the house and keep the door safe." But the food wasn't for the beggar. It was for his dog, which was sitting under his feet. Mr. Tramp then ordered the waiter to chase the beggar away, claiming that the beggar was ruining his appetite. After finishing his meal, he wandered around the market. By now, it was starting to get dark. Mr. Tramp was slightly drunk. A sudden urge to urinate hit him. He unbuckled his pants and walked into a narrow alley. Although he could have held it until he got home, Mr. Tramp decided to relieve himself right there, to save on water for washing at home. He stood by the wall, starting to take care of his needs. The smell of urine made him more alert, and he briefly noticed someone sitting next to him. He thought, who would be sitting here, doing their business in public? He thought he was the only one relieving himself, but someone else was so frugal that they were defecating in the street. But when he looked closer, wasn't it the beggar from earlier? Why was he dead here? Even more terrifying, the beggar had his eyes wide open, staring directly at him. Mr. Tramp cursed, quickly pulled up his pants, and walked out, not forgetting to splash a bit of urine onto the beggar's corpse. As soon as he stepped out of the alley, Mr. Tramp saw several ragged individuals fighting over something. Oddly, why were these strange young men playing around here at night? Upon closer inspection, it was a fresh, delicious-looking peach. In the mood, Mr. Tramp grabbed the peach. He thought the beggars didn't deserve such a delicious fruit. They must have stolen it from somewhere. Since he was craving some fruit to freshen up after the meal, he eagerly bit into it, enjoying the taste. After finishing, he wiped his mouth, expecting the beggars to glare at him, but instead, they gave him a strange smile. Suddenly, Mr. Tramp felt his stomach grumbling. Even though he had just eaten, he now felt extremely hungry. To his horror, he noticed his face sagging. He touched it, and within moments, his cheeks sank in. His clothes also became loose. He had visibly lost weight. Shocked, he realized that from being a fat man, he had turned into a skinny beggar. Just as he was still reeling from the shock, he heard his dog growling. The dog no longer recognized him. The dog lunged at him and started biting furiously. Mr. Tramp was completely bewildered, not understanding why his dog was acting so aggressively. He quickly ran away from the dog he had raised for so long. Once he reached the market street, his stomach growled in agony, as if it were being torn apart. He thought about going to a tavern to fill his stomach, and quickly ran toward it. However, after patting himself down, he realized he had no money on him. This was strange. He always kept money in a hidden pocket in his coat. At this point, his intestines ached terribly, and Mr. Tramp felt the intense pain of hunger. He had no choice but to beg for food, but the tavern owner chased him away without hesitation. Unable to endure the hunger, Mr. Tramp saw some leaves by the roadside. He thought, "I'm too hungry now. I'll risk it and eat these for now." He immediately grabbed the leaves and stuffed them into his mouth. Mud and insects mixed in with the leaves, but he swallowed them all. But the more he ate, the more intense his hunger became. He writhed in pain on the ground. After a while of agonizing, he died of starvation right there. His death was a sad sight. Just hours ago he had been full, and now he was dying from hunger in such a pitiful manner. In his delirium, Mr. Tramp saw the beggar's ghost from the alley appear. The ghost told him that what he had suffered was the same as what the beggar had gone through before dying. If only Mr. Tramp had shown a bit of compassion, he could have saved a life. Suddenly, Mr. Tramp woke up with a start. He realized that, at some point, he had fallen asleep next to the beggar's dead body. He sighed in relief, realizing it had all been just a nightmare. Perhaps he had fallen asleep because he was too drunk, but the fear still lingered. He knew the nightmare had served as a warning to him. So, he hired people to clean up the beggar's body and bury it properly. Now, his conscience had awakened after experiencing the agony of starving to death. From that moment on, Mr. Tramp became more generous and began doing good deeds. He worked harder, saving money to help more poor people.